Judge Thomas Reynolds sat in his high-backed chair, his gavel resting near his hand. It was just another routine day in his courtroom, filled with cases he considered minor. People came and went, some trying to argue their way out of fines, others just accepting their punishments quietly. He had seen it all before. To him, this was just another day, another person standing before him, another case to close quickly. The next name was called. A black woman stepped forward, her posture straight, her expression calm. She was dressed neatly, but simply, wearing a dark blazer over a modest blouse. Her hair was pulled back, and she carried herself with quiet confidence. The judge barely glanced at her before looking down at the case file in front of him. Her name was Monica Caldwell. The charge was a traffic violation, a parking ticket that had supposedly gone unpaid. Judge Reynolds had handled hundreds of these cases before. They were simple. The law was the law. If the fine wasn't paid on time, there was a penalty. He didn't see any reason to waste time on it. "You've been charged with failure to pay a parking fine," he said in a firm tone. "The penalty stands at $200. Do you have anything to say before I finalize the fine?" Monica opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say much, the judge continued. "This is a straightforward matter," he said, tapping his pen against the desk. "The ticket was issued. The deadline passed. That's all there is to it." Monica, still calm, kept her voice steady. "Your Honor, I understand, but I believe there may be a misunderstanding." Judge Reynolds glanced at the clock. He had a long list of cases to get through, and this was just one of many. He sighed. "Miss Caldwell, I've seen many people come through this courtroom with similar claims. Everyone thinks their case is different. The rules apply to everyone the same way." There was a slight shift in the room. A few spectators looked between Monica and the judge, sensing something in his tone. The bailiff, standing near the door, adjusted his stance slightly. The clerk flipped a page in the court records, glancing at Monica curiously. Monica did not argue or raise her voice. She simply said, "I respect the law, Your Honor. That's why I'm here today." The judge nodded impatiently. "That's good to hear, but it doesn't change the fact that you need to pay the fine." He reached for his gavel, ready to bring the case to a close. Monica remained still. Her calm presence was unshaken, but something in her eyes suggested that the judge might be making a mistake. A moment of silence passed before she spoke again. This time, her words would change everything. Judge Reynolds tapped his fingers on the desk, his patience growing thin. He had many more cases to go through, and he didn't see why this one needed any more discussion. The facts were clear in his mind. A ticket had been issued. The fine was not paid on time. And now Monica Caldwell was here to face the consequences. He looked at her again, this time with mild annoyance. "Miss Caldwell, I had a lot of cases to get through today. If you have something important to say, please get to the point." His voice was firm, almost dismissive, as if he had already decided the outcome before she even had a chance to speak. Monica remained calm, her expression unchanged. She was not intimidated, nor did she seem upset. She simply said, "Your Honor, I understand that you have a busy schedule. I just want to clarify a few things about this case." Judge Reynolds sighed, shifting in his chair. "I've heard this before," he muttered under his breath, though not loud enough for anyone to call him out on it. He had seen so many people stand before him, claiming there was a mistake, hoping to avoid paying a fine. Most of them had no real argument, just excuses. He assumed this was the same. Monica continued, unfazed. "According to the citation, the ticket was issued while my car was parked outside a government building. However, I had a permit for that location. I believe there was an error in how the ticket was processed." Judge Reynolds barely looked at her as he responded. "Then why wasn't this resolved earlier? Why let it get to this point?" His tone carried a hint of disbelief, as if he doubted her words entirely. Monica took a slow breath before answering. "I actually did try to resolve it," she said. "I contacted the office that issued the ticket, and I was told it would be reviewed. I never received a follow-up, and then I was informed of this fine. The judge gave a small, tired chuckle. That's what they all say, he said, shaking his head slightly. His voice was not harsh, but it was clear he had already made up his mind. The problem is, Miss Caldwell, that these cases follow a process. If a fine isn't paid, it escalates. If there was a mistake, it should have been handled before it got to my courtroom. A few people in the courtroom exchanged glances. Some sensed the dismissive tone in his voice. Others simply watched, waiting to see how Monica would respond. Monica nodded, her face still calm. "I understand, Your Honor," she said. "I just want to make sure we're handling this the right way." Judge Reynolds tapped his gavel lightly against the desk, signaling that he was ready to move on. "The right way," he repeated. "The right way is following the rules. That's what I'm here to do." Monica stood tall, her eyes steady. She was about to say something that would make the judge, and everyone else in the room, see things very differently. The courtroom was silent for a moment. Judge Reynolds had already reached for his gavel, ready to close the case. To him, this was nothing unusual, just another person standing before him, trying to argue their way out of a fine. He had seen it so many times before that he hardly paid attention anymore. But then Monica spoke again, her voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, I'd like to formally identify myself. My name is Congresswoman Monica Caldwell." A ripple of surprise spread through the room. The clerk, who had been flipping through papers absent-mindedly, suddenly looked up. The bailiff, standing near the door, shifted his stance slightly. Even a few people sitting in the back of the courtroom leaned forward, whispering among themselves. Judge Reynolds blinked, his expression frozen for a moment. He hadn't expected that. His fingers, which had been gripping the gavel, loosened slightly. He glanced back down at the case file in front of him, as if checking to see if he had missed something important. Monica stood there, waiting, her expression unreadable. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't upset either. She had simply stated a fact, one that had suddenly changed everything. The judge cleared his throat. "You're a member of Congress." His voice had lost some of its earlier sharpness. "Yes, Your Honor," Monica replied smoothly. "I represent my district in Washington, and like every other citizen, I respect the law and follow the process when necessary." Judge Reynolds sat back in his chair, suddenly looking uncomfortable. He glanced around the courtroom, realizing that all eyes were now on him. The people who had been watching quietly now had a different expression, one of curiosity, maybe even quiet amusement. The judge let out a short breath, his mind racing. He had been so quick to dismiss her, assuming she was just another ordinary person trying to get out of a fine. But now, knowing who she was, something felt different. Had he been too harsh? Had he been too quick to assume? He flipped through the file again, though he knew there was nothing new there. He was stalling, trying to regain control of the situation. "Congresswoman Caldwell," he said, his tone now much more measured. I wasn't aware of that." Monica tilted her head slightly. "No, Your Honor, you weren't." She wasn't being rude, but there was something about her words that carried weight. Judge Reynolds tapped his fingers on the desk, feeling a strange sense of unease. He had always prided himself on treating every case fairly, but now, for the first time in a long while, he wondered if he had really been fair at all. The courtroom remained quiet, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. For the first time that day, Judge Reynolds found himself at a loss for words. Judge Reynolds sat still for a moment, his mind racing. He had been so sure of this case, so certain that Monica Caldwell was just another person trying to argue against a fine. But now, knowing she was a congresswoman, something felt different. He could feel the weight of the silence in the courtroom, the quiet expectation from everyone watching. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his usual authority. "Congresswoman Caldwell," he said, his tone now much more careful. I wasn't aware of your position." Monica remained calm, her eyes steady. "I understand, Your Honor," she said, "but that's exactly the point. The way I was treated before you knew who I was. Does that change how the law should apply to me?" The words hung in the air like a challenge, though Monica's voice remained even and respectful. Judge Reynolds hesitated, glancing around the room. The clerk looked down at the desk, avoiding his eyes. The bailiff stood straighter, his expression unreadable. The people in the courtroom, who had been passive spectators a few minutes ago, now seemed completely invested in what was happening. The judge shifted in his seat. "I treat all cases the same," he said quickly, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. He wanted to believe that was true. He had always told himself that he was fair, that his decisions were based on the law, not on personal judgment. But as he looked at Monica, he wondered, had he really listened to her at all? Monica gave a small nod, her face thoughtful. "Then let's consider that," she said. "Before you knew my title, I tried to explain that there was a mistake, but I wasn't given the chance to fully speak. If I weren't standing here as a congresswoman, would my voice have been heard?" A murmur spread through the room. Judge Reynolds felt a tightness in his chest. He thought back to the way he had handled the case, quick, dismissive, unwilling to hear more than a few words before making his decision. Had he done this before? How many other people had walked away feeling unheard? The judge let out a slow breath, his fingers tapping against the desk. He wanted to defend himself, to say that he was just following procedure, that he had meant no harm. But deep down, he knew that wouldn't be entirely honest. "I see your point," he admitted finally, his voice quieter than before. Monica nodded, but she didn't look triumphant. She wasn't trying to embarrass him or make a scene. She simply wanted him to understand. "That's all I wanted to say, Your Honor," she said. "I respect this court. I respect the law. And I hope that respect goes both ways, for everyone who stands here, no matter their title." Judge Reynolds swallowed. He had never been made to question himself like this before. The courtroom remained silent, waiting for what he would do next. Judge Reynolds sat in silence, his mind spinning with thoughts he wasn't used to confronting. He had always prided himself on being fair, on treating everyone who came before him with the same impartiality. But now, with Monica Caldwell standing before him, he wondered if that was truly the case. He had judged her quickly, assuming she was just another person trying to avoid responsibility. He hadn't given her the chance to explain herself fully, and the realization stung. For the first time in a long while, he felt uncomfortable in his own courtroom. The weight of his earlier words and actions settled on him like a heavy burden. He couldn't ignore the feeling that he had been too quick to dismiss Monica. Had he done the same to others in the past? The courtroom was still, the only sound the soft tapping of Judge Reynolds' fingers on the desk. He glanced at Monica, who stood patiently, not demanding anything from him. She wasn't angry, nor was she asking for special treatment. She had simply pointed out an oversight, and it was making him question how he approached his role as a judge. Monica didn't say anything more. She let the silence hang in the air, knowing the judge needed time to process what she had said. She wasn't looking for an apology. She wasn't interested in making him feel guilty. She simply wanted him to understand the importance of treating everyone with fairness and respect, regardless of their status. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Judge Reynolds broke the silence. "I apologize," he said, his voice low but sincere. "I should have listened to you more carefully from the start. I made assumptions that weren't fair." Monica's expression softened, but she didn't smile. She simply nodded, acknowledging his words. "Thank you, Your Honor," she replied quietly. "I know this wasn't easy, but it's important that we all take the time to listen. To really listen, before making decisions." Judge Reynolds looked down at the case file in front of him, his mind still turning. He had been a judge for many years, and he had always believed that his rulings were based purely on the law. But now he realized there was more to it than that. There was the human element, the ability to listen, to understand, and to treat everyone with dignity. For a long moment, he remained silent, reflecting on everything that had happened. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that his approach needed to change. He had been too focused on following procedure, too quick to apply the law without considering the broader context. He turned back to Monica, who was still standing patiently before him, waiting for his next words. "I'm going to dismiss the fine," he said, his voice more confident now. "And I'm going to take your words to heart. From now on, I'll make sure I listen more carefully to everyone." Monica's eyes met his, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, she allowed herself a small, quiet smile. It wasn't a smile of victory, but one of understanding. She knew this moment was important, not just for her, but for the judge as well. It was a moment of growth for both of them, a reminder that even those in positions of power could learn something new. As Monica turned to leave the courtroom, she felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. She hadn't won a case. She had opened a door for change, and sometimes that was even more powerful. The rest of the day went by much slower for Judge Reynolds. The cases came and went, but his mind was no longer focused solely on the law. He found himself thinking about Monica and the conversation they'd had. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted within him, a realization that maybe the work he had been doing for so many years needed to evolve. The people who came before him weren't just names on a list. They weren't just cases to be wrapped up quickly and efficiently. They were individuals with their own stories, their own lives, their own struggles. And while he had always prided himself on being a fair and just judge, he now understood that fairness meant more than simply following the rules. It meant listening, understanding, and treating every person with the respect they deserved. It was easy to get caught up in the routine, to go through the motions of courtrooms and hearings without truly connecting with the people who appeared before him. But now, Judge Reynolds was aware of how often he had rushed through cases, how many voices he had brushed aside without fully hearing them. He had assumed that everyone's intentions were the same as his, that they all just wanted to get through the process. But Monica had reminded him that not everyone came to court with the same background or experiences. When the next case came up, Judge Reynolds found himself paying more attention. He listened closely to both sides, not just hearing the words but trying to understand where each person was coming from. He took his time before making a decision, asking questions when something didn't make sense, and offering the chance for both sides to explain themselves fully. The people in his courtroom were surprised by the shift. Many of them had been used to the judge's usual quick decisions and no-nonsense attitude. They weren't used to seeing him take the time to listen, to consider their circumstances before passing judgment. But as the afternoon went on, Judge Reynolds noticed something surprising. The people who appeared before him seemed more willing to open up, to share their side of the story without feeling rushed. It was as if they could sense that he was truly listening, that he was trying to understand them beyond just the surface details of their case. By the time the last case of the day arrived, Judge Reynolds felt different, more connected, more aware of his responsibility. The courtroom, which had once felt like a place of routine and procedure, now felt like a place of real human interaction. He wasn't just issuing fines or sentences. He was making decisions that impacted people's lives. And he realized that the way he made those decisions mattered. As the courtroom emptied and the day drew to a close, Judge Reynolds sat back in his chair and thought about the events that had led him to this moment. Monica Caldwell had walked into his courtroom as just another person facing a ticket, but she had ended up teaching him something he had never expected. He thought about how easy it had been for him to make assumptions, how quickly he had decided that her case was just like so many others. But now, he understood that those assumptions had prevented him from seeing the bigger picture. He had been so focused on the rules that he hadn't considered the person behind the case. It was a humbling realization, but one that he was grateful for. Judge Reynolds knew he couldn't change everything overnight, but he was committed to being better. He would carry this lesson with him in every case he heard from now on. He would listen more, think more deeply, and remember that every decision he made had an impact on someone's life. As he gathered his things and prepared to leave the courthouse, Judge Reynolds felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't a feeling of superiority or power. It was the quiet satisfaction that came with knowing he had done something meaningful. He wasn't perfect, but he was willing to learn and grow. And that, he realized, was what truly made a good judge. He knew that his path as a judge would never be the same again. He had learned something valuable that day, and it was something he would carry with him for the rest of his career. The days following Monica Caldwell's court appearance felt different for Judge Reynolds. He had taken her words to heart, and he could feel the shift inside himself. He wasn't the same judge he had been just a few days ago, rushing through cases and assuming that all he needed to do was stick to the rules. Now, every case felt more personal, more significant. Each person who stepped into his courtroom seemed to deserve more of his attention, more of his understanding. As he sat at his desk, reviewing the cases for the day, he found himself thinking about the conversations he had had with people over the years. His colleagues, lawyers, and even defendants. He had always been known as someone who followed the rules to the letter, someone who kept the law sacred and precise. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that laws were created to serve people, not the other way around. They were meant to protect, to ensure fairness, and to keep things in balance. But somewhere along the way, he had started to see them as rigid, unyielding, and disconnected from the human experiences they were meant to shape. It wasn't that he had never cared about fairness before. It was just that he had focused so much on procedure that he hadn't always seen the people behind the cases. Monica had opened his eyes to that, and now he felt a deep sense of responsibility to listen better, to treat everyone who appeared before him as a unique individual, not just a case to be handled. Judge Reynolds took a deep breath as he reviewed the files in front of him. Today's cases were just as varied as any others. Traffic violations, minor offenses, and a few more serious matters. But for the first time, he wasn't focused solely on the fine details or on getting through each case quickly. He was focused on the people involved, wondering about their stories, their lives, and why they had ended up in front of him in the first place. He looked at the first case. A young woman had been caught driving without a license. Normally, Judge Reynolds would have issued a fine or possibly a warning, then moved on. But today, as he looked at the details, he felt a sense of curiosity. What had brought this woman to the point of driving without a license? Was it an accident, or had she simply made a mistake? He wanted to know. He wanted to hear her side of the story, to understand why this had happened. When the woman entered the courtroom, Judge Reynolds greeted her with a nod. He could see the nervousness in her eyes, the tension in her posture. She was young, probably in her early 20s, and she seemed to be carrying the weight of something on her shoulders. As she stood before him, she explained that she had been driving because she couldn't afford to take public transportation, and she had missed a vital job interview. Instead of interrupting her or rushing to issue a fine, Judge Reynolds asked her more questions, wanting to know about her situation. He listened as she explained that she had been trying to get her life on track, struggling to find a steady job, and trying to juggle everything without much support. Judge Reynolds sat back, listening intently. He thought about how easy it would have been to simply follow procedure and issue a fine. But now, with his new understanding of the law's human side, he saw that there was more to consider. He didn't just see someone who had broken the law. He saw someone who was trying to make it work despite the odds. When the woman finished, Judge Reynolds spoke, his voice calm and thoughtful. "I understand the situation you're in, and I respect your honesty," he said. "I'm going to waive the fine today, but I want you to be more careful in the future. And I also want you to think about getting help with transportation. There are resources available that could make this easier for you." The woman looked up in surprise, her face softening as relief washed over her. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As she left the courtroom, Judge Reynolds felt a sense of satisfaction that he hadn't felt in years. He had made a decision that was not only fair, but also compassionate. He had listened, understood, and taken the time to consider the bigger picture. This was the kind of judge he wanted to be from now on. As the days passed, Judge Reynolds found himself more and more aware of how much his perspective had changed. The lessons he had learned from Monica Caldwell had sparked a transformation that had affected how he approached every aspect of his work. The quiet moments of reflection that had followed their conversation in the courtroom continued to stay with him, reminding him that being the judge wasn't just about applying the law. It was about serving people. He thought about the people who came before him in court. In the past, he had seen them as cases to be processed, but now he saw them as individuals, each with their own story. Whether they were there for a minor infraction or a more serious charge, he understood that each person had their own reasons, their own challenges, and their own struggles. They weren't just names on a docket. They were people whose lives were being affected by the decisions he made. One afternoon, a case came before him that truly tested his new approach. A woman in her 30s stood before him, charged with theft. She had been caught shoplifting, and the evidence seemed clear. In the past, Judge Reynolds would have likely issued a fine or sentenced her to community service. He would have focused on the law, without asking too many questions about why she had done it. But today, as he looked at her, he found himself wondering what had led her to this point. The woman appeared nervous, her hands trembling as she stood before him. She didn't seem like someone who had a history of crime. Her clothes were modest, her eyes tired and red, as though she had been crying. She wasn't acting like someone who was proud of what she had done. Judge Reynolds decided to ask her more about her situation. "Can you tell me why you did this?" he asked, his voice calm and gentle. The woman hesitated at first, as if unsure of whether she should share her story. But after a moment, she spoke. "I didn't want to steal," she said softly. "But I'm a single mother, and my son is very sick. The hospital bills have been piling up, and I lost my job a few months ago. I didn't know what else to do. I saw the food at the store, and I just thought maybe I could take it, just for him. He's been so hungry." Judge Reynolds listened intently as she spoke. He could feel the weight of her words, the desperation and fear in her voice. She wasn't a criminal. She was a mother trying to provide for her child. He understood that the law had to be upheld, but he also understood that this was a situation where punishment alone wouldn't solve anything. After she finished speaking, Judge Reynolds leaned forward slightly. "I believe you when you say you didn't want to steal," he said thoughtfully. "And I know that this situation must have been incredibly difficult for you. But stealing is still wrong, and we can't ignore that." The woman's face fell, and her eyes filled with tears. Judge Reynolds could see that she was already carrying the weight of guilt, and he didn't want to add to it unnecessarily. He paused, considering the options. He didn't want to punish her. He wanted to help her. "I'm going to offer you an alternative," Judge Reynolds said, breaking the silence. "I'll dismiss the charges against you, but only if you agree to meet with a social worker and explore resources for people in your situation. There are organizations that can help with medical bills, food, and other support services. I want you to get the help you need." The woman looked at him, her face full of surprise and gratitude. "Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you so much." He nodded. "But I need you to take this seriously. This isn't just about the law. It's about making sure you and your son can get the support you need. I want to see you succeed, and I want you to have a chance to build a better future." As the woman left the courtroom, Judge Reynolds felt a sense of fulfillment that he hadn't felt in a long time. He had made a decision that wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about giving someone a chance. He had listened to her, understood her struggles, and found a way to help her move forward. Later that day, as Judge Reynolds sat at his desk, he thought about how different his approach had become. It wasn't just about rules and sentences anymore. It was about understanding the human side of the law. He had learned that compassion didn't weaken justice. It strengthened it. When you take the time to understand why people make the choices they do, you open the door for real change. Judge Reynolds had changed. He was no longer just a judge issuing rulings. He was someone who listened, someone who cared about the people who appeared before him. And in that moment, he realized that this was the true purpose of the law: to guide, to protect, and to help people create a better life for themselves.